The rain had started before nightfall, a cold, steady drizzle that quickly turned the earth to mud. I was in Switzerland, tucked into a remote part of the Jura Mountains, far from any villages or other signs of life. It was late October, and the autumn air carried a biting chill that hinted at the coming winter. The thick canopy above barely filtered the gray light, leaving the forest dim and shadowy even during the day. My dog, Max, a sturdy German shepherd with a coat thick enough to shrug off the rain, was my only companion on this trip. I had planned this camping trip as a chance to escape the noise of everyday life, to test myself against nature with nothing but a tent, some basic supplies, and Max by my side. I didn't choose the Jura Mountains for their beauty, though they were stunning. I chose them because they were quiet, remote, and unspoiled. The silence of the forest was only interrupted by the rustling of leaves and the occasional sound of wildlife. The day had been uneventful, though the clouds hinted at the rain that would come. I set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. My tent was sturdy and waterproof, a necessity for this kind of weather, and I'd secured it with extra stakes to prepare for the possibility of a storm. Max roamed the clearing as I worked, sniffing the ground and occasionally lifting his head to scan the trees. He was always alert, and I trusted his instincts more than my own. By the time the rain started, I had a small fire going, sheltered by a makeshift tarp I strung between two trees. I cooked a simple meal, sharing bits of it with Max, and watched as the sky darkened. The rain pattered on the tarp and leaves around us, a constant rhythm that drowned out other sounds. As night fell, the forest transformed. The rain grew heavier, and the wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. The fire struggled against the damp air, its light flickering weakly. Max curled up near me, his ears twitching at every sound. I felt safe with him there, his presence a reassuring constant in the otherwise wild and unpredictable night. I retreated to the tent as the rain intensified, zipping the flap tightly shut and settling into my sleeping bag. Max lay at my feet, his body a warm, solid weight against the cold. Outside, the rain hammered the tent, and the wind howled through the trees. I felt a deep sense of isolation, but also a strange kind of peace. That peace didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to Max growling. It wasn't loud, just a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the tent. I froze, my heart pounding as I tried to process what was happening. Max's growl was a warning, and I knew better than to ignore it. I listened carefully, straining to hear over the rain and wind. At first, I heard nothing unusual, but then there it was, a faint rustling, almost drowned out by the storm, came from outside the tent, moving slowly, deliberately. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but the sound didn't match. It wasn't the quick, scurrying movement of a small creature or the heavy, cautious steps of something larger. This was different, calculated, almost human. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make too much noise, and flicked it on. The beam illuminated the tent's interior, casting long shadows that danced with every movement. Max was on high alert, his ears pricked and his body tense. His growl deepened, a clear warning to whatever was out there. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The rain blurred the beam, but I could see the clearing was empty. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I saw no movement, no sign of anything unusual, but Max's behavior told me otherwise. I stayed awake for hours, my flashlight in one hand and a knife in the other. The rustling came and went, always faint and just far enough away to be maddening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I never saw or heard anything definitive. Max remained alert, his growls soft but steady, his eyes fixed on the tent's entrance. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me. I didn't mean to fall asleep, but my body gave out, and I drifted into a restless slumber. When I woke, it was still dark, though the rain had lessened to a light drizzle. Max was standing at the tent flap, his nose pressed against the fabric, his body rigid. I felt a jolt of fear as I realized something was wrong. I unzipped the tent slowly, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The clearing was empty, but something was off. The firewood I'd gathered earlier was scattered, and the tarp I'd hung over the fire was gone, ripped away by either the wind or something else. Then I saw them, footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were too large, and the spacing was all wrong. They circled the tent, moving closer at some points and farther at others. My chest tightened as I realized someone, or something, had been out there while I slept. I packed up camp as quickly as I could, my movements frantic but methodical. Max stayed close, his eyes scanning the trees, his growls now replaced by a tense silence. I didn't want to stay long enough to find out who or what had been there. The hike back to my car was grueling. The rain had turned the trails to slippery mud, and the forest felt darker and more oppressive than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Max stayed close to my side, his presence the only thing keeping me grounded. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to my knees. I loaded my gear and Max into the vehicle, not bothering to clean the mud off. I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The rain-slicked road twisted and turned through the forest, and every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of civilization, that I allowed myself to breathe. But even then, the unease lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, about the rustling, about the strange sense of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and maybe it's better that way. All I know is that I won't be camping alone in the Jura Mountains or anywhere else, anytime soon. It was early October, the kind of time when the leaves had just started turning shades of orange and red. My husband, Jake, had been itching to go on a camping trip before the weather turned colder. I wasn't much of a camper, but I liked the idea of getting away from everything for a while. He found a spot that wasn't exactly on the beaten path, a long-abandoned quarry about 30 miles from town. It wasn't listed on any official camping site, but Jake had read about it in some forum and thought it would be perfect for a quiet weekend away. The quarry was surrounded by dense woods, with only a narrow, winding dirt road leading in. We packed light, just enough for one night, tent, sleeping bags, some snacks, and a couple of flashlights. Jake had insisted we wouldn't need much since it was just for one night. When we arrived, the place looked eerie in a way I couldn't quite explain. The quarry itself was massive, a wide expanse of jagged rock and gravel that stretched far into the distance. In the middle of it was a deep, dark pit filled with stagnant water, reflecting the gray sky above. Rusted machinery, cranes, conveyor belts, and trucks was scattered around, long forgotten and covered in vines. The whole place felt like time had stopped decades ago. We parked the car near the entrance and hiked a short way to find a flat spot for the tent. The woods were quiet, unnervingly so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the gravel. I chalked it up to being out of my comfort zone, but the silence made me uneasy. We set up the tent near the edge of the quarry, far enough from the pit to feel safe, but close enough to see the water glinting in the fading light. By the time we finished, the sun was dipping below the treetops, and the shadows stretched long and dark. After a quick dinner of granola bars and some water, we decided to explore a bit before it got completely dark. Jake was excited to check out the old machinery, but I stayed back, my eyes darting to every movement in the trees. Something felt off. The air was heavy, like a storm was coming, but the sky was clear. Jake wandered off toward a rusted crane, and I decided to walk along the edge of the quarry pit. The water looked even darker up close, almost black, and I couldn't see the bottom. I kicked a small rock into it and listened as the sound of the splash echoed unnaturally. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, almost washed away by time, but definitely human. Bare feet. The prints led away from the water and into the woods. I called out to Jake, but he was too far to hear me. I stared at the tracks for a while, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe someone had been here before us. Maybe a local had been swimming in the quarry. But why barefoot? As the sun disappeared completely, I felt an overwhelming urge to get back to the tent. I hurried back and found Jake already there, rummaging through his backpack for the flashlight. He seemed calm, unfazed, but I couldn't shake the unease. The night settled in quickly, and the temperature dropped. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the thin fabric of the tent our only shield against the outside world. The quiet was absolute. No wind, no animals, just the sound of our breathing. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the gravel outside. My heart stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. I convinced myself it was just the wind, even though there hadn't been a breeze all day. Jake was sound asleep beside me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening to every creak and groan of the tent, every whisper of movement outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to the sound of something scraping against metal. It was faint but distinct, coming from the direction of the old machinery. My stomach tightened. I nudged Jake awake, and we both sat in silence, listening. The sound came again, louder this time, a slow, deliberate scrape. Jake grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. He swept the beam across the quarry, but nothing was there. Still, neither of us could go back to sleep. We sat there, fully dressed, waiting for dawn. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up quickly, neither of us saying much. As we walked back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bare footprints I'd seen the evening before, they were fresh again, leading from the quarry pit to the edge of the woods, directly past our tent. We didn't stay to investigate. We got in the car and drove away, the quiet of the quarry fading into the hum of the engine. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Jake brushed it off as paranoia, but I knew better. Something or someone had been out there with us. I still don't know what they wanted or why they didn't do more, but one thing is clear: we were never alone in that quarry. I work as an assistant for a small construction company. My boss, Kevin, had this habit of taking on jobs in remote locations to avoid competition. It was good for business, but it also meant that sometimes I had to go to places that felt like they were in the middle of nowhere. This time, it was a private property deep in the woods of northern Idaho. Kevin had promised the client a detailed site survey before we could start the project, and since he had other obligations in the city, he sent me to handle it. It was the summer of 2017, and I was 29 at the time. I wasn't thrilled about the assignment, but I knew better than to complain. Kevin gave me a map, some equipment, and a timeline. He also told me I'd need to camp overnight because it would take at least 2 days to cover the area. The property was about 50 miles from the nearest town, and the final stretch was on an unpaved road. It took me nearly 4 hours to get there. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking low. The property was massive, nearly 200 acres of dense forest with a few clearings. The air smelled of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. It felt isolated in a way that made me uneasy. I found a flat spot near the edge of a clearing and set up my tent. Afterward, I unloaded my gear: a GPS unit, a rangefinder, a notebook, and some tools. I also had a small cooler with food and water. Once everything was ready, I decided to explore the area a bit before it got too dark. The forest was thick, with tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches. As I walked, I marked key points on my GPS and took notes about the terrain. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see any animals, not even squirrels or deer, which struck me as odd. By the time I returned to my campsite, the sun had set and the temperature had dropped significantly. I built a small fire and heated up a can of beans for dinner. The light from the flames flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. I tried to relax, but the silence felt oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense up. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I extinguished the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it up tight. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened to the sounds of the forest. At first, it was just the wind and the occasional creak of branches. Then, I heard something else. Faint footsteps, crunching leaves. They were slow and deliberate, not the random movements of an animal. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered close to the campsite, but the footsteps had sounded too heavy for a deer. My heart was pounding, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was coming from somewhere in the forest, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. I sat up, my pulse racing. The tapping continued for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear another noise: branches snapping, leaves rustling, or that eerie tapping. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight. I made some instant coffee and forced myself to eat a granola bar before packing up my gear for the day's work. The second day was even more unsettling. As I moved through the property, I kept finding strange things. In one area, I came across a circle of stones, like a makeshift fire pit, but it didn't look recent. The stones were blackened, but the ground inside the circle was overgrown with moss and weeds. A little further on, I found a tree with deep scratches carved into the bark. They were parallel, too even to be natural. It looked like someone had used a knife or some kind of tool. By mid-afternoon, I felt completely on edge. The forest felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Several times, I stopped and turned around, but I never saw anything. I told myself it was just paranoia, but deep down, I didn't believe it. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to the campsite. I was debating whether to stay another night or pack up and leave, but I knew Kevin would be furious if I didn't finish the survey. Reluctantly, I decided to stay. I rebuilt the fire and tried to focus on my notes, but my hands were shaking. Every noise made me jump. That night was worse than the first. Around midnight, I heard the tapping again, but this time it was closer. Then came the footsteps, circling the campsite. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking just outside the ring of firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the trees, but I didn't see anything. The noises stopped for a while, but then I heard something new, a low, guttural sound, like a growl. It wasn't an animal. It sounded human. I froze, clutching the flashlight, my heart hammering in my chest. The growling stopped, but then something hit my tent. It wasn't hard, just enough to make the fabric ripple. I bolted out of the tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the area. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. The forest was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. I didn't go back into the tent. I sat by the fire, gripping a pocket knife and waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn broke, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear into the back and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw movement in the trees, a shadow slipping between the trunks. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I pressed the gas pedal harder. I never told Kevin the full story. I gave him my notes and told him the property was fine, but I made it clear I didn't want to go back. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never camping alone again. It was late spring when Grandma and her new husband, Bill, decided to go camping. The air was fresh, crisp with the scent of pine trees, and the sky was a perfect shade of blue. Grandma, at 72, wasn't as spry as she used to be, but Bill, a 68-year-old retiree, was determined to prove he could handle the outdoors. It was their first camping trip together, and they were both eager to experience the wilderness. I didn't think much of it when they left, just a bit surprised at Grandma's sudden enthusiasm for the outdoors. The place they chose was a quiet, isolated spot deep in the woods, a few hours from home. I told them to be careful, but Grandma just smiled and waved, her face weathered with age but full of excitement. The campsite was nestled by a lake, surrounded by dense trees. The sound of the water lapping against the shore was soothing, almost hypnotic. The area had a rustic charm. Nothing fancy, just a few picnic tables, a fire pit, and plenty of open space for tents. The weather was perfect, and I figured they'd have a nice, peaceful weekend. But as the evening approached, a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was no logical reason for it, just a gut feeling I couldn't explain. I tried to push it aside and went about my day, but that night, I received a call from Grandma. It was late, and the sun had already set. Her voice, usually steady and calm, sounded shaky. "Everything's fine," she reassured me, but something about her tone made me uneasy. "Bill and I are just fine. We're in bed for the night." I couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but something in the air felt wrong. I had no idea at the time, but something was already happening, something I couldn't foresee. As the days passed, I didn't hear from them much. I figured they were enjoying their time alone, but I kept thinking back to that strange call. On the third evening, I decided to check in again. Grandma answered after the second ring, her voice a little strained but not overly so. "Everything's fine," she said, though there was a slight tremor in her words. "We've just been a little tired. It's so quiet out here. Too quiet." I asked her what she meant, but she brushed it off. "Just the usual wilderness sounds. No big deal." Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling in my gut. I decided to drive up the next day to make sure they were okay. When I arrived at the campsite, I was immediately struck by how eerily quiet it was. There was no rustling of animals, no wind blowing through the trees, nothing. Just silence, broken only by the soft ripple of the lake. I parked the car, my heart beating a little faster than usual, and walked to the camp. Grandma's tent was there, and so was Bill's, but something didn't feel right. I called out to them, but no one answered. A chill ran down my spine. I found Bill's hat lying on the ground near the fire pit, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen. My first thought was that maybe they had gone for a walk around the lake, so I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out their names. But after walking for nearly an hour, I found nothing. No sign of them. That's when I started to panic. I made my way back to the campsite, hoping to find some clue as to where they might have gone. Grandma's tent was undisturbed, but Bill's was a different story. It was ripped open, the fabric torn as if something or someone had been in a hurry. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the destruction. What had happened here? A few feet away, I spotted something glinting in the dirt. It was a knife, its handle covered in dirt, the blade reflecting the faint sunlight. I picked it up cautiously, wondering why it was there. Had it fallen from Bill's belt? Or had it been used for something else? I shuddered at the thought but shoved the knife into my bag, hoping it might provide some answers later. With no sign of either of them and my anxiety climbing, I decided to call the authorities. A ranger arrived a few hours later, and we began searching the area together, methodically combing through the forest. We didn't find anything at first, but then, just as the sun was starting to set, we heard a faint noise, a rustling in the bushes off to the side. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. We moved cautiously toward the sound, stepping lightly through the underbrush. The noise was faint, but it was definitely there. Then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Bill's body was sprawled on the ground, partially hidden by some branches. His face was pale, eyes wide open, frozen in terror. A few feet away from him was Grandma, kneeling in the dirt, her face pale and drawn. I rushed to her, but as soon as I reached her side, she looked up at me with an expression of pure terror. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. He's not the same. He's changed. I don't know what's happening." I looked at her, confused and terrified. What did she mean? Bill was dead. But how had it happened? And why was Grandma acting so strange? Grandma didn't make sense, her words coming out in frantic bursts. "It's not him," she kept repeating. "It's not Bill anymore. He attacked me. He tried to..." She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting to the woods around us. She grabbed my arm. "We have to leave. We have to go, before it's too late." I tried to calm her, but she was hysterical, shaking uncontrollably. I looked around, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light, and I realized something was terribly wrong. Whatever had happened to Bill, it had also happened to Grandma. She wasn't the same either. I helped her to her feet and made her walk back toward the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't look back, not even once. The further we went, the more frantic Grandma became, muttering under her breath. "We should have never come here. We shouldn't have come." Her voice was barely audible, and I couldn't tell if she was talking to herself or to me. We made it back to the car, but as soon as we drove off the campsite and into the woods, I could still feel that oppressive weight pressing down on me. Grandma had changed, and the feeling in my gut was no longer just a feeling. It was real. Something wasn't right, something that couldn't be explained. I took her straight to a hospital as soon as we reached the town, and after a few days they ran tests. The results were inconclusive, but one thing was certain. Grandma wasn't the same person she had been before. She had a wild look in her eyes, as if something inside her had snapped. And Bill? Well, they never found his body. Authorities said there had been no signs of foul play, but I knew something had happened, something far worse than I could understand. To this day, I have no idea what happened that weekend. There are no answers, no explanation. But every time I think back to that trip, to the dark woods and the strange feeling that never left me, I can't help but wonder if we stumbled upon something better left untouched. Whatever it was, it left a mark on all of us. And I can never go camping again without feeling that same unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I've been working as a woodsman for the past 12 years. It's a job that doesn't exactly put you in the spotlight, but I love it. It's the kind of work where you're alone a lot, and most of the time, that's exactly what I want. I'm used to the forest, the silence, the long stretches of empty ground between patches of thick trees. My boss, Alan, well, he's a good guy. We don't talk much, but he's a solid guy to work with. Sometimes he'd send me out for longer stretches of time, especially for remote jobs. That's how I ended up in the Black Pines, a place I knew well. But something was different this time. It was late fall 2017. The leaves had just started to turn, and the weather was still warm during the day, but the nights had a bite to them. Alan had given me a simple job: check a few plots of land, set up some cameras, and make sure the trail systems were intact. Easy enough. It would take a few days, maybe a week if we were unlucky with the weather. We arrived at the base camp early in the morning, just as the sun was rising over the mountain ridges. It was quiet, too quiet. Alan and I set up camp quickly. I took the north side of the site, which had a small creek running through it, while he worked on the south side. We both had tents, though I never liked using one unless it was absolutely necessary. I preferred a simple shelter made from tarps, something quick to throw up and just as easy to take down. Alan didn't mind the tents, though. He thought they were more comfortable, especially with the cold creeping in. The first day went without incident. We checked the traps, replaced batteries in the cameras, and spent a few hours clearing overgrown paths. The trees seemed to be alive with rustling, the wind occasionally whipping through the branches, but that was typical for the area. By late afternoon, I noticed something odd: a set of fresh tracks, human tracks. They weren't too far from camp, maybe a couple hundred yards off the main trail. The footprints were light, almost as if whoever made them didn't know the ground well enough to leave a solid mark. I figured it was someone from the nearby town, maybe a hiker, maybe a hunter, but still, something didn't sit right. We were deep in the Black Pines. Not many people ventured this far out. That evening, we ate our dinner, a simple stew over the fire. I don't know why, but I kept feeling like we were being watched. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but every rustle in the bushes, every snap of a twig, made me jump. Alan noticed it too. He looked up, squinting into the trees, but said nothing. When night fell, we settled in for the night. Alan went into his tent, and I lay down under the tarps, staring up at the stars. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling sound. Slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was just an animal. The Black Pines were full of deer, bears, and even some smaller critters that could make that sound. But this was different. This was too slow, too heavy. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam slicing through the dark trees. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but the noise didn't stop. It came from just beyond the camp, like something or someone was moving slowly around our perimeter. I kept the light on it, hoping I'd catch a glimpse of whatever it was. But all I saw were shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I went back to where I'd found the tracks. The ground was soft, and I was able to make out more prints, larger, heavier than before. These ones seemed to go deeper into the woods, into an area I hadn't explored yet. I told Alan about it, and he didn't seem too concerned, but he agreed that we should be cautious. After all, the woods were unpredictable, and we couldn't be sure who was out here with us. The day passed like the one before it. More trail checks, more cameras. It wasn't until dusk, when we were finishing up, that I saw it again. The figure. I don't know what it was. At first, I thought it was Alan, but this wasn't Alan. This thing was tall, its silhouette hidden by the trees, but I could see its movement, slow, deliberate, like it was pacing, waiting for something. I froze. My hand gripped the axe handle tightly as I watched it. I couldn't hear anything except my heart pounding in my chest. It was standing there, at the edge of the trees, just watching. Then it was gone. I didn't say anything to Alan. He wouldn't have believed me anyway, and the last thing I needed was for him to think I was losing it. So I kept quiet, but my nerves were shot. I couldn't focus. My head kept turning to look over my shoulder, checking the trees, checking the shadows. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the branches. It was louder than usual, and it sounded like whispers, faint, like something was trying to communicate. The air was thick, heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being surrounded. Felt wrong. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, it wasn't just one set. It was multiple, all around the camp. They were moving in circles, getting closer and closer. I gripped the axe again and went outside, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was nothing there, just trees, nothing but darkness. I stayed up, listening. Hours passed, and the sounds didn't stop. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I woke Alan up, and we packed up what little we could. We weren't far from the road, but I didn't want to be out there any longer than necessary. We packed up fast, breaking down the tents and throwing everything in the truck. As we drove down the dirt road, I couldn't help but glance back. In the rearview mirror, I saw something, a figure, standing just at the edge of the trees, watching us drive away. I never went back to that part of the Black Pines again. Some things don't need explaining. Some things are better left alone, forgotten, and never spoken of again. The tracks? They never led anywhere. It was as if they stopped at the edge of the forest, fading into nothing. Maybe they were never there. Maybe it was all in my head. But something wasn't right. Something was waiting out there, and I don't think it was human. I still don't know what it was, but I know it was out there, and I won't forget what I saw in that rearview mirror. Whatever it was still watching. I had always loved camping. The smell of fresh pine, the quiet of nature, the sound of a crackling fire. It was peaceful. I usually went with my friends, but this time I decided to go solo. A friend had recommended a spot deep in the woods, a little-known trail called Devil's Hollow, about a 3-hour drive from where I lived. It was off the beaten path, surrounded by dense forest, with only a few scattered cabins around the area. He promised it was one of the best places to disconnect from everything and find some solitude. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, just before sunset. The area was quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I parked my car near a small clearing and set up camp, laying out my tent and preparing for the night ahead. The sun dipped lower in the sky as I got my campfire going. The smell of burning would fill the air, and I leaned back against a large rock, watching the flames flicker. I had been out there for maybe an hour when I noticed something strange. There was a rustling sound coming from the woods, not the usual noise from animals or the wind. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. I froze for a second, straining to listen. The sound stopped, then started again, getting a little closer this time. My first thought was that it could be another camper, but I didn't see anyone else around. I grabbed a flashlight from my backpack and scanned the edge of the forest, but saw nothing. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Still, the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but I've learned over the years that when you're out in the woods alone, your instincts become sharper. I shook it off, convincing myself it was probably just a deer or something, and went back to my fire. The evening passed uneventfully. I made some instant noodles and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. By around 9 p.m., the sky was pitch dark, and I crawled into my tent to sleep. I left the fire burning low, just enough to keep a warm glow going. I didn't feel unsafe, but I also didn't want to be too far from the fire. The thought of being out in the pitch-black forest with no light or warmth was enough to make me hesitate, even if I was a seasoned camper. Sometime during the night, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of movement outside my tent. I lay still, holding my breath. There was no mistaking it. Footsteps again. This time, they were slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling my camp. My heart raced and I gripped my flashlight. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. The person was close, too close. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but something in my gut told me not to. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I waited in complete silence, praying whoever or whatever was out there would just go away. After a long, agonizing minute, the footsteps faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling. My mind kept racing. Had someone been stalking me? Was it another camper? Or was it something worse? The next morning, I packed up my tent and started to head down the trail. I wasn't about to leave right away, but I had a bad feeling in my gut, like I was being pushed to leave. As I packed up, I noticed something odd. The small, weathered trail sign that marked the campsite had been moved slightly. The ground around it was disturbed, like someone had been digging or trying to move it. I took a deep breath and continued on my way, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my stomach. The sun had risen fully now, and the woods were alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary, but it wasn't until I was a few miles down the trail that I noticed it. Footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, leading down the trail in the opposite direction of where I had come from. Whoever had been out there last night had been following me. The tracks were large, more like boots than shoes. I had no idea who they belonged to, but I was starting to feel more and more uncomfortable. As I continued walking, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was still out there, just out of sight. Around noon, I came across an old cabin. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and covered in dirt, the porch sagging under the weight of time. Something about it didn't sit right with me. My curiosity got the best of me, though, and I approached cautiously. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of mildew and rot filling my nose. Inside was a mess. Furniture turned over, old food cans scattered on the floor, and a fireplace that had long since gone cold. I stepped further inside, trying not to touch anything. In the back corner of the cabin, there was a small wooden table, and on it was a collection of old maps. Some were faded, others had notes scribbled on them in a hurried hand. One map caught my eye. It showed the surrounding forest, with trails marked in red ink. And there, marked on the map, was a spot labeled The Hollow. My blood ran cold. I had been staying near Devil's Hollow, the very spot marked on the map. But there was something else. There were other markings near the hollow, small circles, almost like a warning. Whoever had been here before me had known something I didn't. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I backed away from the table. The footsteps from last night flashed in my mind. Whoever had been following me had probably been here too. Maybe they weren't just another camper after all. I ran out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods around me felt different now, oppressive, like they were closing in. I had to get out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. My footsteps were loud on the trail, too loud, like I was making myself a target. I pushed on, trying to outrun the terror creeping up my spine. I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I fumbled for my keys, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. But the road behind me was empty, silent. I threw my gear in the trunk, slammed the door shut, and drove off without a second thought. The drive back was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, the footprints, and the map. Had I been on the brink of something dangerous? The woods, quiet and serene on the surface, had hidden something much darker, something I had barely escaped. I didn't go back to Devil's Hollow. I don't think I ever will. I never thought a weekend camping trip could go so wrong. It was supposed to be just a simple getaway, a way to escape the hustle of work and recharge in the quiet of the woods. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and like most of my friends, I love the outdoors. A bit of hiking, setting up camp, a fire, and good food, nothing more. That's all it was supposed to be. I decided to go alone that weekend, a much-needed solo retreat. My friends had all bailed last minute, and honestly, I didn't mind. I enjoy the peace and solitude of nature. I'd picked a spot up in the mountains near an old, quiet trail, one I'd visited before a few years ago. It wasn't far from the nearest town, just far enough to feel disconnected. The kind of place where you don't hear cars, people, or anything man-made. Just the wind, the trees, and the occasional animal. It was a perfect autumn evening when I got there. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and the setting sun cast a golden hue over the trees. I parked my car in a small, gravel lot just off the main trail, gathered my gear, and set out toward the campsite I had in mind. It wasn't a marked site or anything fancy, just a little clearing I'd found a few years ago. It was peaceful and secluded, which is why I liked it so much. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without issue, the sleeping bag was laid out, and I started a small fire. The crackling of the flames was comforting as I sat back in my camp chair, sipping on a warm cup of coffee and watching the lights slowly fade. It wasn't too cold yet, but I knew the temperature would drop as the night wore on. A few minutes later, the fire was roaring, and I felt the heat on my face as I stared into the flames. Everything seemed perfect, quiet, peaceful. It wasn't until later in the evening that things started to feel off. I had just finished dinner, a simple camp meal, and I was planning to enjoy the night sky for a bit. The stars were always clearer in the mountains, and the thought of seeing the Milky Way stretched across the sky was something I was looking forward to. I went to grab my flashlight to head down to the riverbank nearby, where I usually stargaze when I'm out here. That's when I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows. But when I looked more closely, I saw something unnatural. There was a dark shape against the tree line, not too far from where I had set up camp. It wasn't moving, but it didn't look like anything I had seen before. The way the light from the fire hit it, it almost looked like a figure standing still. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just a tree or some large rock. But the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I became. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It wasn't just an odd shape anymore. It was too tall to be a rock, and its edges were too defined to be part of the trees. It looked wrong. My heart started racing, but I didn't want to freak out. I grabbed my flashlight, determined to walk over and see what it was. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe a pile of fallen branches or something had formed an odd silhouette. I stood up and walked toward the edge of the clearing, my steps heavy and uncertain. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the area in front of me. The closer I got, the more I could make out. That's when I realized something horrible. It wasn't just a shape. It wasn't a tree, a rock, or a pile of branches. It was a body. First, I thought I was imagining it. I nearly froze in my tracks. The figure was lying on the ground, partially covered by dirt and leaves, but I could see enough to know that it was human. I don't know what made me keep walking toward it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just in disbelief, but I had to know. I reached the body and knelt down beside it. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Something faint but putrid, like rot mixed with earth. My stomach turned, and I fought the urge to gag. It wasn't a body that had just recently fallen. This was someone who had been out here for a while. The skin was pale and mottled, the clothing old and weathered. The face, well, it was almost unrecognizable, but I could see the faint outline of a man, someone who had been out here for far too long. His skin had shriveled and darkened, his eyes hollowed out, and his mouth hung open in a grotesque, silent scream. I felt a chill run down my spine. My mind was racing. Who was this? How did they get here? Was someone still around? I glanced around nervously, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped me. The longer I stared at the body, the more questions piled up in my mind. It was clear that this person hadn't been killed out here. They had died elsewhere, probably weeks ago, and somehow their body had ended up in this spot. Had they been hiking and gotten lost? Had someone left them to die? Or was there something more sinister going on? I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I knew I needed to report this to the authorities, but the thought of going back to the car, finding service, and calling for help made me feel trapped. I was out here alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no one else around to help me. I couldn't just leave the body. I knew I had to find out more, so I tried to move it to see if there was anything I could learn about what happened to this person. But as soon as I touched their arm, the entire limb snapped off with a sickening crack. It was like the body was nothing but a shell, hollow, decayed, and fragile. That was when I noticed the blood. There was no fresh blood, nothing like that. But something had been leaking from the body's nose and mouth, staining the ground underneath it. It wasn't just old decay. The blood was fresh. The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. Someone had been out here recently. Someone who was possibly connected to this body. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to leave. I didn't care what I had to do. I wasn't staying here another minute. I grabbed my things as fast as I could, stumbling as I tried to pack up my campsite. I wasn't thinking straight, I just needed to go. The entire time I was packing, I kept hearing sounds. The wind wasn't blowing, but it sounded like twigs were snapping all around me. It was impossible, but I couldn't help but feel like someone was out there, watching me. I froze at the edge of the clearing, trying to listen for any sign of life. I didn't hear anything at first, but then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A single, unmistakable sound. A soft rustling from behind me, followed by the unmistakable snap of a twig. I whipped around, but the clearing was empty. The body was still there, in the same place, as though it hadn't moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I took off running. I didn't care about the flashlight, my bag, or anything. My feet pounded against the trail, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I couldn't see anything behind me, but I could feel it. I was being followed. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, always a few paces behind me. I ran faster, my legs burning, but it didn't matter. I didn't look back until I reached my car. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and threw the car into gear. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway with the town lights in sight. Even now, as I think about that night, I can't explain what happened. Was it some sick joke? Or was there something more sinister at play out there in the woods? All I know is that I never went back to those mountains again. And I don't think I ever will. There are things in the woods, things that shouldn't be there. And some things should never be found.